Hello everyone, Ben Weekly back for session number 8 today, and I hope that you've read the corresponding chapters in the book. Concerning chapter 8 has to do with the boiler operation procedures for steam boilers, and that's what we'll be talking about today, is how you operate steam boilers. In subsequent later chapters and sessions, we'll be talking exclusively about hot water boilers, but there is a little bit of difference in the operation between the two. Now, I, as a boiler operator for 30 years, have always been fascinated with steam boilers. For me, they were always much more interesting and much more fun to work with, because you dealt with the water on a daily basis. You did various procedures, manual procedures on that boiler on a daily basis and weekly and monthly basis. And it just, to me, it was a lot more fun to operate steam boilers versus hot water boilers. But today we're going to talk about steam boilers. Now, like I said, I've been a boiler operator for 30 years, and for 25 years here in northern Minnesota, I've taught boiler classes, low pressure boiler classes to men and women, many of them, so that they could further their knowledge of boiler operation and achieve their boiler licenses in Minnesota. Now, I've talked about this in almost every session. I recommend that you get some books. And the first book I recommend is Low Pressure Boilers by American Technical Publishers. It's written by Howard Steingress. It's a very good book to read. And my boiler classes online here on YouTube follow the chapters in this book. So make sure that you get this particular boiler book, so that you can really learn and understand boilers. The other book that I would recommend is this complimentary book to the textbook, Low Pressure Boilers Study Guide by American Technical Publishers. It has all kinds of great information in it, drawings and quizzes and so forth that complement the textbook. Now, what I just showed you was the 4th edition. Currently, they have the 5th edition that they are selling, and so it's made by American Technical Publishers. This was a little change in this book compared to the last one. There is no reference to the burning of coal in this book, which is being very speedily phased out of the low pressure boiler industry. And there is more information on hot water boiler operation. So make sure that if you're serious about getting and obtaining or upgrading your boiler license, you get these 2 books and study along and listen along to the complimentary chapters as I give them in these sessions here on YouTube. Now, if you are living in Minnesota and you want to study to get the beginning license, introductory license, it's called a special license here in Minnesota. Other states may have different terms for it. This is the book I would recommend that you purchase if you're from Minnesota, especially. Safe Boiler Operation Fundamentals, Special Engineer's Guide for the state of Minnesota. So, and you follow along in this book and match up the sessions on YouTube that I give along with the subject matter in this particular book. So that's some side information there that would be very beneficial to you. And if you're really serious about obtaining your boiler license and upgrading your license, these are great resources to have. And if you own them, you can refer back to them, because basically the fundamentals of boilers, it hasn't changed for years and years and years. So it's like riding a bicycle. Once you learn it and fully understand it, and you've operated it, you just don't forget it. Those principles are always there. Okay, so much for the books. Now, I want to tell a little story about how to become a boiler legend in your business. Well, you have to take this story with a little tongue-in-cheek, and it comes with a little humor. And it goes like this. A boiler operator came into his boiler plant, into the building early. Many times boiler operators in facilities that are used for heat, not so much for processing, but for heat, these guys get there early. And of course, it's not the only thing they do during the course of a day, by any means. Anyway, the boiler operator came to work that morning, and he checked his boiler over. He looked at the gauge glass, he blew down the water column, he looked at the pressure gauge, checked the low water fuel cutoff and flame scanner and safety valves, logged all of that stuff down and tested his water, and he thought everything was good. And he went about his day. Now in Minnesota, could it be in the wintertime, you might be outside shoveling snow. Or he could have been cleaning up some mess somewhere in the building. Or doing a little bit of odd repair on equipment or something. But anyway, about 9:30, 10 o'clock, he gets a call from the office. And so he goes into the office and they say, "It's cold in here. And we don't know what's going on. It's chilly. We're freezing." It's not 32, of course, but that's the term you hear. It's freezing. He says, "Well, I'll go down to the boiler room and I'll check on the boiler and find out what's going on." So he leaves the office and he's scratching his head trying to think of what possibly could be wrong here. He gets into the boiler room and he kind of retraces his steps. Looks at the logbook. Now, what did I do? I did the bottom blowdown. I did this. I tested the low water fuel cutoff, and then it hits him. He forgot to reset the switch on the low water fuel cutoff. Oh, wow. He hits the switch on the low water fuel cutoff and the burner starts up and he's got heat again, just like that. Well, he went about his day, and about an hour and a half later, he comes past the office, and it's toasty warm in there. And they're curious. "Hey, what did you do in the boiler room with that boiler? What went wrong in there?" "Oh," he said, "it took me a little bit of time," he said, "but I figured it out." "And everything okay in the office?" "Oh, yeah, it's nice and warm in here." "Okay, well, have a good day." And he turns around and he leaves the office. And the people in the office look at each other and they say, "Boy, that guy really knows his stuff." So that's how, I guess, you become a boiler legend. So much for stories. Let's talk about the operation of steam boilers. One thing with the operation of steam boilers is there's so many different sizes and different types of boiler plants. You might have a small boiler for a small building. You might have 2 or 3 larger boilers for a medium-sized building, or you might have 6 or 8 boilers for very large buildings. So taking over a shift sometimes for a small plant means the person that's in charge of the boiler comes in the morning and he checks on stuff, making sure that that steam boiler is operating correctly. Well, what's the first rule of coming into a boiler room when you're beginning work? With a steam boiler, the number one thing you have to check is the water level. Bar none, the number one thing you have to check is the water level. If you don't have proper water level, you're in trouble immediately. Now, it doesn't happen very often, fortunately, because we have such great equipment these days. But checking that water level is very crucial. The water level has to be at the NOWL. Heard that term before? NOWL means normal operating water level. And that's shown in the gauge glass. Now, the gauge glass is usually attached to the side of something called the water column. And so making sure that your gauge glass reads accurately is crucial to the safe operation of that boiler. So blowing down your gauge glass and water column in the mornings or when you take over a shift is very crucial. That lets you know. You don't have to take anybody else's word for it. It lets you know that the water level is where it's supposed to be. Now, the other thing you need to check immediately is the steam gauge or the pressure gauge. You need to know where your pressure is at. In low pressure boilers, it's never over 15 psi. That is as high as you can operate with low pressure boilers. So if you come into a boiler room and your boiler is operating, say, between 4 and 7 psi, you're going to be looking at that gauge glass and see, well, it's reading 5, 6, 7, and it'll vary depending on the cycle of the burner. So you look and you see what the NOWL is, and then you look at the pressure gauge. The highest pressure that you can have in a low pressure boiler is what's called the MAWP, maximum allowable working pressure, MAWP. Now, it will vary from boiler to boiler, but in low pressure boilers, steam, we're talking steam now, in low pressure steam boilers, it'll never be over 15 psi. Okay, the other thing that you will do is test the low water fuel cutoff. What does the low water fuel cutoff, what does it cut off? Well, it's built into the name. It cuts off the fuel. It cuts off the fuel. Anytime there's a problem with the water level being too low, it cuts off the fuel. Sometimes if the water level gets too high, that can be a tremendous amount of problems with your boiler as well. So there are some boilers that have systems that monitor too high a water level as well. The low water fuel cutoff can be checked and tested a couple of different ways, but always remember, if you're testing a low water fuel cutoff, the burner has to be going, or you would have no idea if it cut off the fuel or not. So when the burner is operating, you open and the blow down on the low water fuel cutoff, and the steam and water goes through it, and the low water fuel cutoff, the float ball in there drops, and it shuts off the fuel. In steam boilers, they also do a more reliable and accurate test, perhaps once a week or once a month, depending on your plant procedures, but that's called the evaporation test. You would shut off the water coming in that keeps the boiler full of water, and you'll stand there and never leave the boiler as it's running, hopefully down in low fire, and you watch the gauge glass, the water level dropping, and before that water goes out of sight in your gauge glass, the burner should shut off. So those are two different ways. Now, there are other types of low water fuel cutoffs. The one is the electric, where they have probes. And usually those probe types have test buttons on them that you test, and then once you test it, Of course, the burner has to be running to make sure it shuts down. But once you test it, then you have to reset it to get back to normal operation again. So we have the low water fuel cutoff and how to test it. That has to be taken care of. We should be blown down once a day or once a shift. The other thing, when you come in, you want to make sure that your feed water system is working correctly. In a steam boiler, having water replace the water that's being boiled to steam is critical. So watch your boiler operate. And I've seen too many situations where people operate boilers and have a lot of other things to do, custodial work or maintenance work or outside grounds work, that sometimes they neglect the boiler operation. So at least once a week, stand there by your boiler and watch it operate. Watch it run. Watch it go through the burner cycle. Watch it go through the cycle where the steam pressure raises, cuts out, drops back down, cuts in and starts the burner, and goes through the sequence. Watch your feed water systems and check on those to make sure that everything is correct on that. So give yourself a little bit of time for your boiler operation. Don't cheat yourself on that. The other thing is, those of you that operate boilers out there, many of you work in schools, nursing homes, hospitals, that type of thing. Other people work in processing plants where they have boilers going perhaps 24 hours a day, so it's a little different situation. But sometimes there's a temptation to make the top of that boiler a storage rack. And boilers are not meant to be storage racks. So don't be putting stuff up on top of your boilers where your safety relief valve is and where perhaps your low water fuel cutoffs are and your pressure gauges are. The top of your boilers, that's no place to be putting cardboard boxes and junk. So make sure that you keep your boiler room clean and neat and orderly. Generally speaking, a boiler inspector comes around and he can take a look at a boiler room when he walks in, and he can almost tell whether this boiler is being operated correctly just by the fact that if it's in orderly shape, clean, and not a bunch of junk all over the place, the boiler inspector probably knows that that boiler operator takes a little bit of pride in what he does and is probably operating that boiler in a safe manner. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the bottom blowdown. You come into work, you check over things, you make sure that your water level is correct, you make sure that the pressure is correct, and then you would do what's called a bottom blowdown, and we described that previously. So the bottom blowdown is conducted. Then on some of the bottom blowdown valves for boilers, you'll see different setups. Larger boilers will have two bottom blowdown valves. And the bottom blowdown valve that's closest to the boiler is called a quick opening. It seals nice and tightly, but it is not meant to stand the wear and tear of hot water rushing out the bottom of the boiler. So that quick opening valve closest to the boiler is open first. Then the boiler valve that's further away is called the slow opening valve. Slow opening valve has to have 5 complete turns before it's completely open. That's the one that takes the wear and tear of the water rushing out of the boiler. And that's the one you open last, but you close that first. The quick opening valve you open first and close it last. It's not meant to take the rush of hot water coming out of the bottom of the boiler. So you would do your bottom blowdown. Then, of course, you would check your flame scanner. You do that, of course, with the burner in operation. And there are different boilers that have different types of flame scanners. Check your operation manuals on how they would recommend you check your flame scanner. But in any case, the boiler has to be in operation to test it to see if it's actually shutting down on a simulated flame fail. The other item that needs to be checked routinely is your high limit switch. And so with the boiler in operation, you would turn down the limit switch so it goes below the operation level, and it would shut off the burner. So I'll tell you what, here's a real good rule, something to always keep in mind, that if you have any kind of problem with your boiler, any kind of problem, low water, something doesn't smell right, something doesn't feel right, something doesn't look right, you got a hunch something isn't right, shut off the burner. That's the default. Shut off the burner. You can never go wrong by shutting off the burner on a boiler, because once you identify what the problem is, or once you find out that there really isn't a problem, you can always turn it back on. So always keep that in mind. If you come into the boiler room and you look at your steam gauge, and the steam gauge is way down, way below what it should be, shut off the burner. If it's way too high, shut off the burner. You need to investigate what is going on. Is it a broken steam gauge? Or is there really not enough steam? Something has broken the piping? Or is there way too much steam? So, whenever you have a problem with a boiler, you come in, you sense a problem in any manner, shut off the burner. You can't go wrong doing that. The other thing that needs to be checked on a steam boiler at least once a month, and perhaps, depending on plant procedures, perhaps more often, that's the safety valve. The safety valve, of course, is built and set so that it will discharge all of the energy that can possibly be put into the boiler through the burner. So the most important safety device or fitting on the boiler, of course, is your safety valve. And you never want that thing to pop. And if it does, you need to find out why. Is there a problem with the valve? Is there a problem with the burner system? Is there a problem with the controls? Because a boiler that gets overpressured is very dangerous. If you come into a boiler room and the pressure is too high, it's beyond what it's normally operating at, shut off the burner and let that boiler cool down, and call somebody that's had some experience on this to find out what's going on. Last thing you want to do is go up there and open that safety relief valve and try to release pressure. You could actuate a boiler explosion by doing that, so leave your hands off of it. Don't touch that safety valve if your boiler is overpressured. Now, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about something else that for many years in some parts of the country, these things were ignored. And that's called boiler logs. Boy, you say, oh, what a pain. I gotta fill this out. Why do I gotta fill it? I'll tell you what, a boiler log is an instrument or a tool that can save you all kinds of problems. By systematically recording your pressures and temperatures and all the various safety things that you do on the boiler, ensures that you don't miss stuff. Believe me, us human beings have a tendency sometimes to forget things. And a boiler log gives you, the boiler operator, the discipline of making sure you don't forget something. Now, boiler logs can go from very simple on small boilers to quite complex on larger boiler systems. So they'll vary all over the book. But most generally, you will see in boiler logs the fact that they'll want you to log your safety valve, your high limit switch testing, your low water fuel cutoff testing, and all of those critical things, the pressures, that type of thing. And there should be a comment section on every boiler log as well that would give you the ability to write in if you ever had a problem or if you ever had any repair done, that type of thing. And so 2 years from now, like I say, we can forget, something could go wrong and you could say, boy, I had a problem like that once before. You can go back to your boiler logs, look through your comments section, and find out what you did at that time. So, boiler logs are very, very important. And in most jurisdictions, they're required. So, and it's to the benefit of the operator. It's not the state or the business trying to look over your shoulder. They're there to protect you, make sure that you don't forget something. Now, in all of my boiler classes, I tell everybody that there's basically four things that stand between you and a boiler explosion. Number one, the safety valve. Number two, the low water fuel cutoff. Number three, the flame scanner. And number four, your high limit switch. So I ask you, if you're a boiler operator, if you're not testing these four things and they stand between you and a boiler explosion, why aren't you doing that? Boiler explosions are something you never want to experience. Boiler explosions on the furnace side from the fuel can cause tremendous destruction of your boiler room. It can blow the burner completely out of your boiler. And boiler explosions, because things became too overpressured and the boiler erupts, are even more explosive. If a boiler explodes because the hot water pressure gets so high that it erupts, chances are you will not have anything working inside of your building. It'll blow the walls out, it'll blow the roof off, it'll split the corners of your building open. It'll make an absolute ruin, not of just the boiler room, but your entire building. So make sure that you're checking those four things: safety valves, low water fuel cutoffs, flame scanner, and high limit switches. Now there's a lot of other things that are on that boiler that aid in the safe operation, but those are the four big main things. It's very rare that you ever have a boiler explosion these days, because we're tending our boilers better, we're licensed and hopefully better educated, we have boiler inspections, and as a result, it's very, very rare that you ever hear about a boiler explosion, which is a good thing. Now, there's a procedure on especially new boilers or boilers that have been perhaps repaired or something done differently mechanically on that boiler, and that's called a hydrostatic test. A hydrostatic test is basically you fill the boiler full of water at room temperature. You don't heat it, you just fill it all full of water. Typically on a brand new installation, they'll fill the boiler completely full of water, and perhaps the boiler inspector will be there, and the mechanical person is running a small pump that pressurizes the boiler, or he'll run a hand pump that pressurizes the boiler, and it goes up to 1.5 times the boiler's maximum allowable working pressure, or 60 psi, whichever is highest. So that a hydrostatic test is done at room temperature. The temperature of the water cannot be, 150, 200 degrees, because if something was wrong with the boiler, something split, they wouldn't want to have that hot water spraying on them. So hydrostatic test usually done on new installations or when some type of major repair has been done to the boiler. Inspections. Generally speaking, steam boilers, low pressure steam boilers, are inspected by a boiler inspector like once a year. And so the boiler is shut down. If you have a boiler plant that's continuously operating, they may take one particular boiler and take it offline and shut it down, cool it down, empty the boiler out, and wash it out and everything. Then they would open up the low water fuel cutoffs. They'd open up the cross T piping on the water column. They would just open up the boiler shell itself so that you could see inside the fire tubes or water tubes, that type of thing. But during a boiler inspection, the inspector wants to be able to take a look at the critical internal components of the boiler to make sure that there's no corrosion going on, that there's no malformation or damage, internal damage in the boiler. Make sure that there's no pitting. They want to make sure that your water column is free and clear of debris and that your low water cutoff is operating correctly. So every year the boiler inspector comes around. These boiler inspectors are not somebody that you need to fear. If you have a boiler inspector come around, take advantage of asking him questions about the operation of your boiler if you have any questions, because these guys, that's all they do. They go from one boiler room to the next. They're experts on this. They have high degree of training. So make use of their knowledge as best you can. Let's talk about some operation failures on steam boilers. One would be a low water condition. If you come into your boiler room and the water level is out of sight in the gauge glass, what do? Number one, shut off the burner. If the burner is still running and it's out of sight in the gauge glass, your low water fuel cutoff didn't function like it was supposed to, and that needs attention. You don't just go back and add water. You never add water to a boiler that's low on water and hot. You can cause a boiler explosion very easily doing that. Never add water to a hot boiler that's low on water. Shut it off, let things cool down, find out what that water level really is before you do anything. And if you've never experienced this, call somebody. Call some repair place or get a hold of your supervisor, whatever, but this is a very serious matter if you run too low on water and that boiler has been operating in a low water condition. So low water conditions need to be tended to immediately. The other thing that's common on boilers is flame failures. If you have a flame failure, your boiler should shut down. Your flame programmer and sensor system should shut down the burner on flame fail. Flame failures can be caused by a number of things, but quite often it's caused by perhaps, like for propane or natural gas, just perhaps some air in the line, or maybe some debris that came through, or perhaps there just for a period of time was just too low pressure, and so your low pressure switch was shut off. So if you have a flame failure, your programmer should shut things down. You should check to see if there's any obvious thing that could be causing this, and then you have to manually reset your programmer to start the boiler again. If you go and if you experience flame fail, stay there with your boiler and watch it operate once it starts up again. If you have repeated flame failures on a daily basis or multiple flame failures in a given day, get a hold of somebody that knows how to repair this situation. You could have a very serious situation there that needs to be tended to immediately. Some of the other things that can shut down steam boilers would be if your feed water pumps are not pumping water and doesn't keep up. You could have a feed water pump that perhaps that feed water pump has lost its effective ability to push the water into the boiler. So those feed water pumps need to be checked on. They can get old and they can wear out. Or perhaps the motor has shorted out and needs to be rebuilt or replaced. So there are times when you just can't operate the boiler because you can't get feed water to it. Every boiler operator should know all the various ways that you could potentially get water into your boiler. Feed water pumps and condensate pumps can also not work because the water coming to them is way too hot. And on the suction side, as it's pulling that condensate or feed water into it, if that water is way too hot, the pressure is low on the suction side, remember. So on that suction side, the boiling point of that water could drop dramatically, and you could be flashing to steam, and that pump could become what's called steam bound. And if it's left in that condition, that steam can injure the pump itself and can erode the centrifugal blades inside the pump. What do? Well, you shut off the pump, of course, and you need to lower the water temperature. Perhaps you have steam traps that are not closing correctly, and you may have live steam coming back to your feed water tank or live steam coming back to your condensate tank. So double check your feed water pumps if you have failures with them, and make sure that you're on top of that. Now, trouble. Let's talk about trouble one more time. What do we do if you have trouble? If you think you have trouble, if it doesn't sound right, if it doesn't smell right, if it doesn't feel right, if it doesn't taste right, whatever, shut off the burner. Shut off the burner. Now, we human beings have an innate temptation to try to fix things ourselves. And so I have developed over the years what I call the monkey rule. If you have something go wrong with your boiler, you follow the monkey rule. What is that? Well, here's it is. Very simply, the monkey rule is, if you don't know what it is, and you didn't know why it happened, and you don't know what would happen if you mess with it, don't monkey around. put your hands, both of them, in your pockets and turn around and go find somebody, go call somebody, or look somebody up that can help you with it. Don't monkey around with controls on boilers. If you don't know what you're doing, you can create a larger problem than the problem that you have at the present time. Well, that about does it. You know, one thing I didn't touch on was the startup and shutdown of boilers. We've talked about a lot of the operation stuff, and we've talked a lot about the operation and some of the trouble things that can happen, but we haven't talked about how to actually start the boiler for the first time and what to do if you're shutting it down. And I didn't talk about that because I want you to read the boiler books. That's much more comprehensive information in the boiler book that can walk you through it. And because every boiler is different. There could be many, many different systems out there. What I would recommend that whenever you take a boiler offline, if you're in charge of that boiler, as you take it offline, write those steps down on a sheet of paper or log them in your computer so you know exactly what you did, what valves you opened, what you closed, what breaker you shut off, what switch was shut off, all the different things that you did to shut that boiler down. Write them down so that when you go to start that up, you're not guessing at what you did. You might have a boiler that's what's called laid up for several weeks or several months, and it's easy to forget all the various things that you did to shut that boiler down. So write them down, post it on the front of the boiler if you have to. Post your boiler as being shut down so nobody accidentally starts it up. If you have a lockout tagout procedure, follow that for your boiler. Now, there's a couple ways that we store boilers that aren't in operation. One is to fill them completely full of boiler water that's heavily treated with boiler chemicals to prevent corrosion and pitting inside the boiler. That's called a layup boiler, wet. A wet layup boiler. So generally a wet layup is for short periods of time. Then, of course, there's called the dry layup. That's when everything is opened up on the boiler is drained and cleaned, and it is completely dried out as best you can. Then it is all sealed up, and on the internal water parts of the boiler, there is quicklime or silica gel added in trays, so that if there's any excess moisture left inside that boiler, it will be absorbed into that chemical and it will not be able to injure your boiler. So that's some two different systems on how to take care of a boiler that's not being used or laid up. The one thing about starting up a boiler that I would say is generally across the board the same for each one, and that is when you fill a boiler with water, you don't fill it up with cold water. Try to get the water that's going into your boiler, try to maintain at least room temperature with that boiler. If you put too cold of water in it, the boiler jacket, the internal conditions, the internal surfaces of the boiler can what they call sweat. It's like pouring very cold water into a glass. You put real cold water into a glass on a warm day and you get sweating and condensate. And the same thing can happen to your boilers and cause pitting and erosion inside your boiler. So I guess that's the whole thing in a nutshell here for boiler operation, low pressure on the steam boilers. the next chapter or two, we will be talking about hot water boiler systems. And so read those chapters. This is session 8. We'll be going to session 9. And in the new 5th edition, I believe for session 9, you should be reading chapters 9 and 10. And we'll take care of that in the next session. In the meantime, safe boiler operations to all of you. Study up, don't give up. Don't give up. So we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. Now also hit the subscribe button and you'll see all of the various channels and all the sessions so that you won't miss out on how to operate your boilers safely.